Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Outlook Business Masterspeak. Today we have with us R Gopalakrishnan. He has been there, done that, and having made his mark in two of India's greatest companies, Levers and the Tatas. He's one of the finest minds with respect to strategy and leadership. But what I really love him for is his wit and wisdom, and even better, his catchphrases, which nail the point in a way you can never forget. He's going to talk to us today about some reset ideas for business leaders. Gopal, thank you so much for being with us today. While we get ready to listen to you in rapt attention, I want to thank our presenting sponsors, Hyperlink Infosystems and co-sponsor RR Solutions for partnering with us on this. Gopal, all yours. You can talk about your ideas and then we'll take up some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mahalakshmi, and greetings to your audience. We are meeting in a strange way, in strange times, but then that's the new normal now. I wish you and all your families very well, and thought I would use this opportunity provided by Outlook Business to see how we can reset our minds during this forced lockdown that all of us have been through. What do I mean by reset? I think I must start there. By the way, the agenda that I have is first to introduce some of the words like reset and then go on, and I've prepared 6 ideas, but I don't think it will be very interesting to go through all the 6. I'll go through a couple of them and then maybe we can have an interaction, Mahalakshmi. I can go through 2 or 3 ideas, but let me first explain what is a reset idea. A reset idea is when you get back to reality. You know, we all have the ability to be staying and living in the past. It happens to all of us. And to illustrate this, I'm going to tell you a story about a young Japanese guy. His name was Hiro Onoda. And Hiro Onoda was born around 1922. And he joined the Emperor's army in 1940 when he was 18 or whatever. And then he was trained to be a very high quality soldier, you know, with alertness and art of warfare. And they airdropped him after training into the Lubang jungle of Philippines. Remember, we are talking about the Second World War times. And he had been instructed that every morning he must get up, he must grease his rifle, and he must wear his goggles, and he must look around left and right and look for the enemy, because no enemy should be allowed to be in that jungle. He did this very diligently because he was trained, and it is something that he wanted to do in the service of the emperor. But he kept on doing it from 1942 till 1971. The war got over in 1945. He was so focused on what he had to do, on the tasks at hand, that he could not keep in touch with his environment. And any attempt to reach him by his old bosses all failed. Finally, in 1971, when he had eaten probably all the berries available in the jungle, they found him. His boss came to him and he said, "Hey, Hiro." He said, "Where have you been? Is the war? How's the war going?" He said, "No, it's now 30 years. The war is over long ago." He said, "Hey, why didn't you tell me?" He said, "Well, they took him back to Tokyo, gave him a hero's welcome, because by this time, remember, he's almost 50 years of age. And then he was given a good retirement in Honshu Island or somewhere. And then he died about 5 years ago, or 7 years ago. Mm-hmm. And that's how the story came out in the New York Times. And I read this story with great interest. What an amazing story. That here's a man who's very diligent, doing everything he had been told, keeping very alert and working incredibly hard. But the times had changed and he ended up being a bit irrelevant. And it caught my fancy because there's a bit of Hiro Onoda in all of us. We tend to be living in the past, like Hiro Onoda. We do it extremely diligently and then find that we miss the right signals of change that were happening around us. So I think occasions like the lockdown give us an opportunity. If Hiro Onoda had learned meditation in the jungle, he might have said, "Is there some other way to look at this?" We've had such an experience through this lockdown. And I sat down and thought, I've been around 50 years, so a long time. What is it that I would say? I'm not going to come to any new truth. It's not a new gospel that I've arrived at. But reiterating some things that we may be missing. So let me tell you that that's what I mean by a reset idea. I'm trying to break out of this mode in which all of us get, that you're so focused on doing that you're on the treadmill, you don't have time to breathe and think, and you lose the wood for the trees. You know, the old days, we said it's an industrial era, then we said it's the data era. We are now in the knowledge era, and that should guide us as to where our priorities can be. To illustrate, when the Pandavas won in the Mahabharata war, it is not that they had any superior knowledge. Neither did they have any great superior arms. They had the same elephants and the same, all that they had was a slightly better organization. So they were organized and they were able to win the war. So that's exactly how many centuries later the Persians lost to the Romans. The Roman Empire expanded. But if you come to Hiroshima and what happened in the Second World War, it was not just organization, it was superior knowledge and technology that was deployed to bring the war to an end. And so I want to emphasize that acquisition of knowledge requires you to have two things: curiosity. If you're not curious, you're not going to be successful. And once you're curious, then of course you must go and learn. So I want to go to the principle of ignorance and curiosity. Ignorance is good to admit. We are very hesitant to admit that we are ignorant. Very often you hear people say, I've been around in this industry or this business for 25 years. I pretty much know what I want to know. But that world itself is changing, as the hero Nada story tells you. So it's this kind of reset that our minds tend to be, we become slaves to our particular circumstance and we do repetitive tasks. We forget the art of ignorance because it's not a nice thing to admit that you're ignorant. And we cease to be curious, which we last were when we were 2 years old, crawling on our knees on our mother's, our father's home. My first big reset idea, I call them big because it is self-evident and yet we miss it. The first big reset idea I want to present is relearning how to learn. Most people I find, managers, including myself, I'm not sitting on a pedestal. I made these mistakes. We think we know what there is to know. I've done my MBA, I'm from IIT, I've gone to Harvard. And we amazingly lose our ability to learn and our desire to learn. It precipitously falls. I want to narrate a little story to show you how precipitously it falls. It's a personal story, which I think may be helpful. And like the Hero Onada story, and there's a bit of Hero Onada in all of us, this story that I'm telling you will show you that there's a bit of a Gopal in all of us as well. So the year is 1987, it's 33 years ago, 23 years ago. And I was only 41 years of age and I was appointed to be a director of Hindustan Lever, the director for exports, and it was a big deal. And if you think of 1987, this is pre-liberalization. I don't know how many of the audience can even remember those periods. It was a big deal to be in a multinational company as a director on the board at 41. So I suppose I must have been slightly pompous and arrogant, which I can admit now freely. And all of us tend to get pompous and arrogant in the course of our work and careers. Now, one of the tasks that I had as a director of exports was to deliver 10% of the turnover of my company, Hindustan Lever, through foreign exchange earnings and exports. And since there's a limit to how much of shampoo and toothpaste we could export, we went into all sorts of non-traditional areas. So leather garments and shoes and carpets and, textiles and so on. Now, we knew nothing about all this. You know, you could go to the boardroom of Hindustan Lever and take a tablet of soap, you would open it, smell it and say what's right or wrong with it. If you presented us several t-shirts, apart from being able to wear it, none of us knew anything about it. So we recruited people from outside to help us. But they came from a different cultural context. I'm not saying all of them are bad. Garment industry or footwear industry has as many bad people as the soap industry or any other industry. But They had domain knowledge, but didn't have our culture. We had our culture, but didn't have the domain knowledge. And I thought we'll make a nice fit of this. As it so happens, I made a mistake. Because we recruited a senior experienced person who was absolutely slick, very slick. And one fine morning, we found $700,000 missing. I don't want to go into the details of it because that will divert us from. But please understand, if you don't remember 1980s, we had a legislation called Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, which was absolutely draconian. If you couldn't find $5, you could go to jail because of criminal offense. And here we were, $700,000 we couldn't find. And for me, the dilemma was, I trusted this man, I gave him the freedom. Has he misused it? If so, why don't I wait another 2-3 days till the facts are clear? Because at the moment, all this is happening, and my CFO is telling me that books are not matching with the physical cash. So one instinct of mine on my part was to wait a few days. There was a second instinct that came to me. Just keep quiet, the problem will go. You know, it's like how bank NPA problems that we see nowadays. Just keep quiet, somehow it will solve itself. And the third one was ask for help. Go and say that you got a mess on your hands. And you know what I did? I did the third one. It took me a lot of effort because I had to relearn to learn. That's my moral of the story. Because in the first, I don't have to admit I'm a fool. But in the last one, I had to admit I was a fool. I've got tricked under my nose. But it occurred to me, and I had some sagacious advice from some mentors, that it's better to admit you're a fool to a few people than to look like a crook to lots of people. And that's what would have happened. The newspaper headlines would have said, Hindustan Lever director arrested, $700,000 as a big scam. You know how it happens. Once it gets out, it becomes far more difficult. So I walked into my chairman and said, you know, I'm going to look like a fool. This is not the way a dashing Hindustan Lever director is supposed to behave. But I just don't know what's happened, $700,000. Luckily for me, he trusted me, and the whole company, the accounts, the audit, the legal, everybody came together and spent the next 7-8 months. We went to the statutory authorities and said, we have a genuine human error that's happened. Please don't harass us. We just, had a loss of control. I must say, to the credit of the Reserve Bank, Finance Ministry, and all the others involved, that they said we cannot charge you for a genuine error, and the matter was investigated and put to bed, and nothing came in the newspaper, right? And that saved me a lot of embarrassment. And I thought I'm going to get fired. But I deserve to get fired, frankly. 41-year-old director now looking for a new job. But the company said, when you make a genuine mistake and you come and admit it and help us to solve it, we are not going to fire you. Because we all make mistakes. So they not only retained me, they actually promoted me and sent me as the chairman of a company in Arabia. So it had a nice little ending. But I mentioned this to you because there are 3 lessons that I learned from this, which are very relevant if you look at the context in which today's Indian economy is. The higher you rise, the more you must discover humility. Because the higher you rise, the more you tend to forget humility. That's human nature. It's nothing to do with me or you. So the higher you rise, the more you must rediscover humility. Knowing humility causes you to admit ignorance and therefore seek to relearn. When you make a serious mistake, admit it. Don't cover up. And lastly, never stop learning. And I think all these 3 came together in what I consider to be the most expensive management training course I've attended in my career. I mean, I've been to programs in IIM, in the Management Association, in Harvard Business School, but this one topped it, $700,000. I don't think even Harvard cost my company only $60,000, $70,000 in those days. So I say this is the most expensive management training I've had, where you fell down, cut yourself, admitted your error, somebody helped you to get back on your feet. And luckily I finished, my career was okay, it was not finished at that time. And I would like to say that in this interregnum that we've had due to the lockdown, do try to remember your mistakes and try to admit them to yourself and be in a ever learning mode. So that's the first reset idea I would like to share with you. My second reset idea is what I've called corporate immunology. Immunology is a very nice word for the current situation with COVID. And it brings to our mind that the human body can be immunized. Not for everything, but for many things, as soon as a particular bug or bacteria or virus gets you. So a company also has visible and invisible predators or enemies. Just like human beings have visible or invisible. It's the invisibles that require immunology. The visible ones don't. So what are the company's visible threats? Competition, regulations, talent, all that is sort of visible. And they teach you a lot about it in your MBA programs, in your post-management programs, and you're able to keep learning. So what is visible is something that you know how to deal with. They are difficult to deal with, but you get trained and you deal with it. The great problem in human health is the invisible stuff. What toxin is being generated in my stomach? What funny ideas are coming in my brain? Which virus is getting me? How many times do I have to wash my hand with soap? And so on and so forth. And the company has exactly the same kind of problem. Because the invisible things are things like the ego of the top leadership, the greed of the top leadership. And there are enough examples, I don't have to be indiscreet and quote them. Outlook Business writes about them regularly, so they can give you a litany of them if you do want. But the whole message came to me in a very live way recently, just 3 weeks ago. There is a person called Miss Abigail Disney, that's her name. And she's the granddaughter of Mr. Disney, of Walt Disney, who began Disney World. Mm-hmm. So now she's just a shareholder. She gets dividends, but she's not involved with the company in management terms. And this granddaughter was horrified one day to learn that the top leadership of the Disney World have decided that they will reduce the pay of 100,000 people, workers, but they have done nothing about the executive bonus or the dividends, which is $1.5 billion. And she let fly, in the public domain. She said, and I'm reading, pay the people who make the magic happen. Treat them with respect and dignity. I repeat, pay the people who make the magic happen. Treat them with respect and dignity. If you're not cutting your own and you're cutting them, you're not paying the people, because you're not the guys who make the magic happen. It's they who make the magic happen. And this struck me as very poignant in the current circumstance. Who makes the magic happen? Migrant workers or the non-migrant workers like you and I? And the fact that this whole country has been brought to a grinding halt and is going to, all the industrialists are saying we can't restart. There have been interviews, and some of you might have heard of these. We can't restart it. We don't have the labor, the people. So corporate crises also come due to this invisible kind of attacks on it. And therefore, I thought of the word, like you have human immunology, is there something called corporate immunology? And how can you immunize the company? And it struck me that I should study the human immune system as a layman's perspective. I found there was a particular immunologist who's turned to be a management professor. So his interesting was very relevant and useful for me. And what he said is the following, and I hope I'm not erring. I'm trying to keep it as simple because I suppose most of you are also lay people. But we have 3 layers of an immune system in our bodies. There's absolutely no logical reason why the human body and the human being should exist, because there are so many bugs and viruses getting us. It's a battle every day. But there is this 3-layer immune system that is protecting us. What is this 3-layer? The first layer is the physical layer, the outer layer, which is our skin, for example. Our skin prevents various things from getting into our body. It repels them, and that's the outer layer. The outer layer equivalent for a company is the passion of its people. You know, when a company is highly engaged people, when they are passionate about their company, that doesn't mean they're always singing hosannas about their company. What it means is that they're proud to work for that company. They don't say, "Arey yaar, yahan pe kuch aisa hi hota hai." If somebody asks them, "Shall I join this company? My nephew or daughter wants to apply to this company," they say, "No, no, don't join this crazy company." That's not what passion is all about. So the outer layer of the human body equivalent is the passion. When you see in a company that there's a buzz and people are very involved with what they are doing, that gives you a sense. That's the first immune layer that the outside body has to penetrate. The second immune layer for a human body is what is called the innate layer. Below the physical layer, there's an innate layer. Innate means it's germane to yourself. Your DNA, for example, is what you've inherited. So if there's been diabetes in the family, that might be a weakness in your immune system. And so the company also has the equivalent of an innate, which I call the... Somehow, this is not the done thing here. That is the done thing here. In some companies, cutting costs is the first thing they think of. In some other companies, they say, let's look after the lower level people. The higher level people give up more. These are all matters of culture. So there's passion in the first layer and culture is in the second layer. The third layer, which is there in our human body, is below the innate system, there is a adaptive system. So if a bug manages, like your coronavirus, gets through the front layer because it gets through your nose or your face, that's why you're not advised to touch your face. And if it gets through your innate layer, then it gets into your body, your bloodstream, and then your system has to work. And they recognize a foreign body, and the antibodies come, and there's a Mahabharat war going on our body all the time. In a company, that happens due to what I call positivity. So
sorry, what
positivity.
Mm-hmm.
So there is an academic professor of psychology called Barbara Fredrickson, and she's done a lot of work on this. If any of you Googles, you'll find. I'm not an expert on these subjects, but my idea is to trigger your thinking and allow you to follow it or research it further. And she has defined what is positivity and what is negativity. And she has come with a simplistic formula. Most of us have got used to this algorithmic way of managing. She says the positivity divided by negativity is equal to 3 or more. You're on a very good wicket. That means your adaptive system is very good. If people are saying, ye sab kuch hone wala nahi hai, ye khatam ho gaya hai, then you get a different ratio and a different response. And if I combine these 3 layers into what I call corporate immunology, I call it people power. People power is equal to passion multiplied by culture multiplied by positivity. And that constitutes the corporate immunology. Most of us are so busy in the course of our day-to-day work, trying to become more efficient, that we forget what it is to be more effective. We pay lip service that people are our great asset, but we don't treat them that way. And again, in the space, without my getting critical or inadvertently bordering on the politics, you can see this happening. You see it in your company. Why should you go out and look at politics?
Right.
And I think my second reset idea is, please think about corporate immunology for your company. How do you strengthen with more respect the people power that's available to your company, because that is what is going to be your immune system.
Before I ask you a question, we'll just take a 5-second break and come back. Welcome back. The first question I want to ask you is, you talked about courage. I mean, your first point of a reset is really about relearning, and fundamental to relearning is you say that you have to admit and have the courage to say I have erred, or
Cool.
I don't know this, and that's how you go back to square one and say that, okay, how do I now get back on track? Now, especially like you pointed out in your own case, when the stakes are high, for example, you committed a mistake and you're saying you lost $700,000, which is a large amount. It could cost you your job, and that might absolutely jeopardize your career. How do you really muster the courage? Because this is really about at that point in time, it's easier to say in hindsight that that's the way you should be as a third person, or even look back in time and say that this is the way to do it. But at that point in time, it's very hard to come to terms with that. So how do you really weigh? Because however you look at it, you may always think that you are at the losing end if you've done something wrong. For example, most CEOs, don't even have the courage, for example, to go to the board of directors and say that this business doesn't look good. Because, or if you talk about fund managers, they don't have the courage to go out and say that, I want to take in weights in my portfolio which are vastly different from the benchmark index, because that puts you at risk. Because you're looking, if your call goes wrong, then you have to take the flak for it. So career risk is something that everybody faces, whatever job you are in. And I think that's what makes most of us less courageous than we would otherwise find ourselves in. So just in the context of this career risk, how do you really tell yourself that, yeah, this is the way to go about it?
That's a very good question, a sensitive one. And I don't think I have a pat answer, to be honest. If I say, no, be courageous, that's not answering your question. But in the thinking, reflections that I have done, and I think it's to do with authenticity, who you really are. When you peel the onion layers, layer after layer, there's a core you, which is not always revealed through your suited, booted, plush, carpeted office scenario. And you have to ask yourself. So I don't want to give you the impression it was an easy decision for me to put my career at risk. Absolutely. I don't want you to think that I was a courageous fellow and I looked squarely at myself in the mirror and said, come on, Gopal, do it now. Nothing of the sort. I was feeling very vulnerable. I could see that I could get sacked. I could see that I would cut a sorry figure with the then prevalent Mahalakshmi type of editors in the newspapers. But I sought counsel. I sought counsel from a more senior director who had been my boss earlier in my career. I said, I'm not sure how to deal with it. I demonstrated, without my intending to do so, a vulnerability that I was willing to ask of another person. And he was the guy who told me, don't try to solve every problem yourself, even if you have created it. Seek help. Go right now and talk to the chairman. So I think if you must have the vulnerability, then you must be willing to admit your vulnerability. Then you seek counsel. And then my throat was parched. I don't think I should give you the impression I stomped into the chairman's room and I sat there. No, I was very quaking.
Right.
But I somehow was persuaded that I have to be myself. And the core of me said, you made a mistake, admit it. You look like a fool. Better to look like a fool to 10 people in the company than to 10,000 people through the media. I think those are the sort of factors that pass through my mind. Those leaders, especially in business, in anything actually, but in business, who are not willing to admit that they've put their career at risk, not because of some machismo or anything like that, but you're asking your officers to take financial risks, to take control risks, to take entrepreneurial risks. You're not willing to risk your own career after making a mistake. Doesn't seem right. So I don't know. That was the. I'm putting it more elegantly now, but at that time it was a horrendous mess. Sure.
Right. Tell me, is vulnerability good at the very top? Because as a leader, you're always expected to show, of course, courage, but you're not supposed to show your vulnerability, because then you pass it on to the rest of the team. So you're always expected to be strong and positive and say the right things. And also when you know that the buck stops at you, do you really have an option to say, well, I made a mistake?
You know, I think in your question, and the definition of what a leader is lies the answer. We have got a wrong impression of a leader, that he must have big blue eyes, a very square jaw, and a person who never makes a mistake. The reality is that in hindsight, you can give a speech on those things, but you're a human being. And a person who doesn't admit his own vulnerabilities to himself or herself. I'm not saying vulnerable doesn't mean that you go like a quaking leaf to the office and tell everybody, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do. Outwardly, you may give the impression of a clarity, but inwardly, you're vulnerable. And because you're vulnerable, you become meditative or reflective. You consult with people. Now you take the current situation that's come due to COVID. It's not that everybody has experience of this. I mean, even if somebody were to argue that the Spanish flu 1918 has similarities, nobody who's alive today was around at that time. So you are like a blindfolded man, seeking your way by feeling, the pillars around you and trying not to fall. But if at that time, in your private moments, you don't have the vulnerability and the willingness to consult with people and devolve power and authority, then you're going to be in a very tough spot. And if you look at the way COVID has gone through the world, dictatorships like Russia, China, Brazil have not come through very well, But I don't know if Brazil is a dictatorship. Technically, it's a democracy. But Russia and China are perfectly good democracies, like Taiwan, like South Korea, seem to have done quite well. And then democracies where machismo people are there, read America, Britain, you can put India wherever you want, but I'll keep to other countries, have come through in between. So I think there's a great thing to be said about devolution of power, involving people, communication and humility. And all that comes in a cluster. I don't think my definition of a leader is a person who's not willing to admit his vulnerability to himself.
Sure.
Vulnerability has certain effects, and it's those effects I'm looking for, which is you become consultative, you become collaborative with people. And it's a great dangerous thing to be totally self-reliant and saying, I'm the guy, I know what to do. I mean, if you look at what Trump is doing, that's exactly what he's doing. Now, I don't want to, I'm looking at Trump from a leadership position rather than from a political position. If you think all the wisdom is with you, then you've got a problem. And that's exactly how a leader should not be.
Sure. Okay, the second question relates to, of course, your second point on corporate immunology. By the way, that's a catchphrase nobody is going to forget. So, so you talk about passion and culture and positivity. And the third one is really the one that is being challenged in times like this. And this is also the time that most leaders have to take very hard decisions, and the hardest decisions in business is also related to people. Letting people go, cutting salaries, and all of these decisions are very, very touchy, emotional issues. How do you really reinstate positivity? Because I'm assuming that from the point we are, I mean, there is a certain loss of positivity already because of the environment. So how do you really create a positive sentiment while you are navigating the environment and and you have to take all these hard decisions?
Actually, you asked a very good question. I don't intend to suggest that you generate positivity when the crisis has come to you. I'm saying your starting position, your opening balance sheet must have positivity, which is 3 times negativity. Because there will always be some negativity in any organization. That will help you to coast through this crisis. During the deep crisis, the ratios may change, but you're not spending your time measuring positivity and negativity during the crisis. So it's like saying, if you have a strong balance sheet with good cash reserves, then when you get into a recession, you can weather it. But during the actual weathering it, your debt equity ratio may be a bit out of line. But it's only a bit out of line because you have something to fall back upon. In the same way, I refer to positivity as an asset that you should be developing right through and not during the crisis.
Sure. And one more question related to people. This is something I think a lot of companies are really grappling with in terms of when you have to cut employee costs, and that seems to be a lever a lot of companies are using. Is there a framework to think about it? Should fairness be a consideration? Should business objectives be the top consideration? Should you care for loyalty of employees? Should you have a flat cut based on work? How do you really get around these things? Because for a lot of companies, there may not be precedents to go with, that this is exactly the way we approach things.
I'll give you a real example. I think I can mention the names of the companies, though I wasn't directly involved. I know of it firsthand. Back in 1992, 93, 94, Tata Steel went through a major restructuring exercise. It's in the public domain. Jamshed Irani was the managing director. And they reduced employment. That was not due to COVID, but due to the liberalization and the flaws that it brought up, weaknesses it brought up. They reduced employment in Tata Steel from, I think, 90, 100,000 to about 40,000. It's not even in the public domain. You don't even know that you had a 60% reduction in the workforce. And as it was told to me, I was not in Tata at that time, but subsequently I was curious how this was done. So I talked to a lot of people. They said, take your decision ruthlessly, but implement it with compassion. So they decided, Irani and his top team, that, we have no choice but to get to 40,000. But how can we implement this compassionately for the 60,000? And in some of my books and writing, I've written about some episodes. I won't go into all of that now. But the thing that leaps out at me is that they said that anybody who's over 55 and who's going, we will pay him his full basic salary till he's 60. In other words, we'll front end the pain that the person is taking and monetize it so that he can do something about it. So there are many companies, it's not just Tata. I'm mentioning Tata because I happen to know a little bit about it. There are lots of companies which do this. The mantra, if I have to leave you with one, is take a ruthless decision but implement that decision with compassion.
Sure. Yeah, we can go on. Next point. Next reset point.
Okay. The third reset point I want to mention is understand when analytics and rationality have run their course and switch your mind and decision making to intuition. Now, in our early stage of our career, let me explain it. In the early stages of our career, you're not trained, you're neither trained nor rewarded to be intuitive.
Right.
You can't come and say, I'm 36, 25 years old, I'm looking after sales in Orissa. I think my feeling is that we should just turn the whole place upside down and we'll be okay. They say, go back to your homework and come and make a proper presentation. Rationality and analytics have a great value. And I don't even remotely want to give the impression that I'm devalued. But by the time you're 35, 40, 45, you have been so trained into rationality and analytics that you've even forgotten there is something called intuition. And when you reach the higher echelons of business management and leadership, you have to fall back on intuition because rationality would have run its course. Example, I want to, somebody has come with a proposal to acquire that company. If I leave it to my accountants and lawyers, they will come and tell me the valuation. But at the end of the day, it's like my wife buys her saris. There is no valuation for the sari. I mean, if she likes it and you want to keep your wife happy, just produce your credit card and you buy it, right? You use your intuition. I stumbled upon the reality, and I wrote a book on that. My first book, The Case of the Bonsai Manager, was exactly on it. That the most important decisions in your personal life are taken through intuition and not through rationality, like whom to marry. If you carry a jot pad in your pocket and keep writing each woman's characteristics and arrive at 6.5 versus 7.2 like they do in the beauty contest, you'll never get married. Or if you do get married, it won't last. How do you select a CEO? Yes, the HR department gives you all the papers and so on, but at the end of the day, you have that half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hour interview, and then you decide intuitively. How do the governors of the Reserve Bank choose interest rates? I mean, governors of the Reserve Bank will kill me for saying this. But at the end of all the analysis, it comes to 25 basis points up or down, right? If you change it by 5 basis points, you won't get any newspaper coverage. You do it by 50, you'll be mauled. So it comes to 25. You use your judgment, you use your intuition. So how do you decide to acquire a company? It's by intuition. So many of the major decisions in our life, both professional and personal, are taken through intuition. And I regard intuition not as an alternative to analytics, but as a continuum. So when you've exhausted the capacity of analytics to tell you shed any more light, then you have to take a jump at the edge of the cliff. Are you going to jump or are you not going to jump? And we take a decision. Sometimes it goes right, sometimes it goes wrong. Hopefully not a life-threatening decision. But you do make acquisitions. You do marry the wrong person. You do have things that go wrong in that situation. So I want to advocate that the third reset idea is to think about how to develop your intuition. And I've written a book on it, and I could keep you here for the next long time. And I don't have a masterful way of doing this. But it largely comes through immersion and reflection. You can follow yogic techniques, you can follow meditative techniques, you can follow spiritual techniques, you can follow highly personal techniques. But whichever it is, if you don't make an attempt to develop your intuition, it won't get developed. That's the message I would like to give. And that's what actually.
Talk about intuition. It's interesting you talk about intuition. And I'm sure you've read Daniel Kahneman. And Daniel Kahneman says that intuition works when the feedback loop is fast and strong. So, for example, in driving, I mean, since your feedback is every day you're driving, so you know exactly how to react to every single thing. So intuition works perfectly. Similarly, in medical sciences, anesthetists get their feedback within minutes or worst case a few hours. So therefore, your ability to develop intuition and decision, and therefore decide based on intuition can be very, very decision making can be a lot better. However, in chemotherapy, for example, where the feedback loop is fairly slow.
In which therapy, sorry?
Chemotherapy, long gestation, chemotherapy.
Chemo.
Where, chemotherapy where the feedback loop is fairly, it's slow. I mean, you don't get to know whether it worked or not worked in a certain situation until a few, months or years. So therefore, in those cases where there is slow feedback, intuitive decision making may not be very rewarding. This is his analysis. So what do you say? I mean, is there a good way to develop intuition? Because in the end, it is about feedback loop, right?
Well, I cannot challenge a Nobel Prize winner. So I don't pretend to. He was talking of it in a particular way, but I'm talking of it in a different way. Whether they are both related, I'm not in a position to. I'm talking of it experientially, what I've been.
Right.
And here's my take: that whether the feedback loop is frequent or not, when you are left with no choice but to use your intuition, because you've exhausted, then you use it, right? And when you use that intuition, your brain is automatically indulging in two activities, or should indulge in two activities. I call them immersion and reflection. Immersion means you're deeply involved with that subject. You know, you can't just visit it for that morning and take in, you must be deeply involved with that. And the second thing about immersion is that you are looking at the object itself. I'm going to illustrate this in a moment through an example. Reflection means you're not focused on the object, you're looking at the context of the object, the surroundings. So let me take a real example, otherwise it sounds a bit ethereal.
Yeah.
When I was young, I was born and raised in Calcutta. I had to learn many languages. Hindi was my first language, Bengali was being spoken, English and Hindi, and Tamil at home. So, you know, many Indians are like that. I'm not special. And I was very incensed that a member of parliament called Purushottam Das Tandon had pressurized the then Nehru government to make Hindi the compulsory national language and the basis for all entrance exams, you know, IAS and all that. And I must have been 14, 15, 16. IAS was certainly within my choice set. And I found what a severe disadvantage I would be if I had to write a whole paper in Hindi. And you'll also remember that at that time, Tamil Nadu or Madras, as it was called, went up in flames, all that we know. Now, if I recreate artificially what must have been going through Mr. Nehru's mind, I wasn't privy to it and I have not read it anywhere either. When he focused on the object, should Hindi be national language? It is there as a policy. He said, yes, it should be there. But perhaps I can alleviate the situation by giving 15 years time. So he said it will be a national language for 15 years. Until then, it will be, you know, concurrent. Then somebody else looked at the context. Why is the Tamil fellow protesting against Hindi? What looked absolutely self-evident to Purushottam Das Tandon looked absolutely ludicrous to Kamraj, you know. And they found that these two don't speak to each other, you know, and that's the problem. So how can you make a Tamil fellow take interest in Hindi? Not by running Dakshin Bharatiya Prachar Sabha, which is what was going on at that time. Right. We were all sent to Dakshin Bharatiya Prachar Sabha to learn Hindi. But some magical angels arrived from heaven. One was called Raj Kapoor, one was called Dilip Kumar, one was called Devanand, one was called Ashok Kumar. They spoke in Hindi, they made love to lovely little girls, they ran around trees, they sang songs which were endearing. It doesn't matter which language you are in. Bollywood became the primary propagator for Hindi.
Right.
Even Urdu, I would go to the extent of saying, you know.
Right.
And one day, about 20 years ago, I was in Tirupurapundi, maybe 10 years ago. And Tirupurapundi, people can't even pronounce that name north in the Vindhyas. And those guys were watching Kaun Banega Crorepati. And I said, Nadi, I told him in Tamil, I said, do you understand a word of what's going on? And he put on his South Indian Tamil drawl and said, sir, when 1 crore is involved, how does it matter which language it is? That's what I mean by the content, the reflection. And very often when you're faced with, even in some of the current situations, I don't pretend to have a prescription for COVID or Swachh Bharat or the various activities that are going on in the national domain. If you think of the object and the context, you start to get insights which you otherwise may not have got.
Sure.
That's my take.
Sure.
I love telling the story of this Hindi because it looks so obvious to most Hindi-speaking people that everybody else should learn Hindi. But you go and look at the guys who are living in Bangalore and find out how many of them have learned Kannada. got a very,
Right.
very poor score. So,
Right. Sure. So we'll take a 5-second break again and come back. And when we come back, we'll take some audience questions.
RR Gifting for memorable brands. Call now.
So welcome back. The first question is from Harnil Oza, CEO and founder of Hyperlink Infosystem. In this situation, can you please share some tips that can help startups and small businesses stay competitive and overcome this crisis? And what is it that leaders can do to keep the teams motivated? I think part of that you've talked about.
I want to just make this response as focused as the question is. I don't see why startups should be different from grown-ups. I'm talking of the answer to the question. I'm not talking of in general.
Right.
You know, if you say that they're expecting a cyclone in Bombay, you say, well, these are the precautions you should take. Then the precautions apply equally to the children as well as to the adults. So I don't see that the startups have anything special. If you're trying to make sure your balance sheet is well stocked, if you have lived a expensive life, even though you're a startup, and there are lots of startups which get billion-dollar valuation, which have led an expensive life, I'm afraid they'll have to come to terms with the situation they are in, as is going on right now, including the mighty SoftBank and the Vision Fund. I think startups must also appreciate that the rules of the game are not dissimilar. They may play them slightly differently. Like tennis is tennis, but I may have a junior tennis court compared to a senior tennis court. And if startups can therefore say that I must make sure that I protect cash, I must make sure that I take care of people. Now, all this will sound like motherhood and apple pie, because that's what you would say to Tata Steel or Hindustan Lever also. I don't see why the startups should expect a different person. The truth is that the startups come to the crisis, or the crisis comes to the startups at a time when their health is very poor. And if your health is poor when the crisis comes, like we say, the elderly people now with, what is it called? Comorbidities. That's the word. Yeah. Diabetes or cancer or something. Then your starting position is difficult. Startups should also understand that mad growth is not in their interest. So I hope I've answered this question.
Sure. So now I'm just going to take a general question because we've talked about leadership at length. So this is from Mukul Vashish, Director RR Solutions. As the company and workplaces open up, it seems the government is putting the onus of protecting people on establishments and their managements. Do you think the establishments are even prepared for such a responsibility? And what steps do you think they can take to ensure a safe environment?
You know, I am a great believer that wisdom rests with people out there. Even for decision making in the course of this talk, I have mentioned that you must, the higher the leader and the more uncertain the environment, the more he must rely on devolution, consultation, dialogue, and stuff like that. So in that sort of train of thought, I think the government is right. Not to pass the buck, but to request. Just like in a family, if you have 4 grown-up sons, the family may say, hey, each of you take care of your own kids as we navigate this particular uncertainty. So I see nothing wrong. It's the job of a family, in this case a company or a startup or a hospital or a club or whatever, to seek advice and take the necessary steps. For example, I have received on the email from the Institute of Occupational Health, what can a building society in Bombay do to protect itself and its members? Things that I would not have thought of, right? In the same way, They've also put out, and it's free. They have put out another list of SOPs for companies and offices. And I'm very happy to send it to you because they have said, if you want to forward this to other people, please do so. And Mr. RR can certainly get it from you, from me through you, if he's interested. So there are a lot of people with lots of knowledge and expertise. The trouble is an added burden. And I understand that that angst, that, oh God, we've got to do all this also. And who wants to have a building society where your forehead is pushed to the thermometer for every person who comes in? But it has to be done.
Sure. Thank you so much, Gopal. I really enjoyed the discussion. I wish we had more time, but thank you so much anyway.
Thank you and all the very best. All the best. Thank you and good luck to you.